Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dynasty Slant. I'm your host, Scott Spratt, joined as always by co-host Michael Moore, and we're going to be running down all of our Dynasty and Keeper League thoughts entering Week 14 of the 2017 football season. Michael, last week I kind of pivoted away in the opener from talking about Jimmy Garoppolo because we had the breaking Eli Manning news, so let me recycle a joke that I had last week. How upset are you that Garoppolo's going to win all of the games to close the season and cost you guys a really good draft pick? Like really upset or just kind of upset?
No, I'm not that upset because if this means that we have solved our post Alex Smith, Colin Kaepernick quarterback question for the short-term future, then I'm completely okay picking like 10th as opposed to second. I'm completely okay with that. If he wins, believe me, I would much rather him win every game from here on out and pick lower than for him to look like a complete dud and then we have to reassess.
Okay, I know you could probably talk about this for 45 minutes, but we have a lot to cover. So let's skip that for today.
That'll be another podcast then.
That's an off-season extraordinaire. But let's go ahead and talk about some of our topics from the weekend of the games.
Oh my God, it's picked off!
Topic 6.
All right, Michael, topic number 1 is the Packers running back situation. I thought this was complicated before, but I feel like it's gotten even more complicated. Ty Montgomery went on injured reserve to get surgery on his injured wrist, so he's definitely done for the year. But with Aaron Jones coming back last week, I thought he was probably just going to take back over as the lead back. Instead, Jamal Williams gets 21 carries for 113 yards against just 1 carry for Aaron Jones. And now I really don't have a great idea how this backfield is going to shake out, not even just for the rest of this season, but entering next season. Do you have any thoughts on how you think this is going to unfold?
Well, and you sort of touched on it. We thought we had a winner in this with Jones, but then Jamal Williams comes on this week. And to his credit, had a pretty big week. I mean, he was pretty volume dependent going in. But no, he did well on a sort of per carry basis and obviously had the game winner there at the end. So, it's just a big mess. And quite honestly, they haven't had a running back, I guess, that they knew for sure was the guy probably since Eddie Lacy's first and second year. And even then they had James Starks on passing down. So this has been a position that has befuddled dynasty players for a very long time. If I had to pick one right now, I think personally I'm definitely eliminating Ty Montgomery. I've never been a fan of Ty Montgomery. He can't put, for whatever reason, he just hasn't been able to stay on the field consistently. And I think the Packers, it's not like they've got a lot of money or time invested in him, so they can move on pretty cheaply. But, but despite Williams' big game, I'd probably lean Jones. Like you said, he's got the better yards per carry so far. He's got the better PFF grade from our graders so far. So, at this stage, I'd go Jones, but it's just a big toss-up the rest of the season, I think.
All 3 of these backs have taken between 70 and 100 carries so far this season. So we have a pretty similar threshold to work with to compare these guys. And they're all very similar with their yards after contact per attempt. Jones is leading at 2.6, but Jamal Williams is just behind him at 2.5. Montgomery just behind him at 2.2. However, I think that's actually a really strong win for Jones because he's the guy with the big playability in the backfield. Last year in college, he had 8 plays of more than 40 yards, which is just obviously very explosive. And he's a more explosive player, the smaller back, whereas Jamal Williams is sort of the inside the tackles, traditional bigger runner. But the fact that Jones is able to push the pile and break those tackles the same way that Williams is, I think speaks really well to his overall ability because he's bringing something to the table that Williams isn't. If he's just as accomplished as Williams is at what Williams' number 1 skill should be, then I'll say Jones. But I think you kind of get into it. I mean, I mentioned that none of these guys has even 100 carries so far this season. It's just not a very big sample. And both of them, I think, have benefited from the schedule to a certain extent. You have Jones had his 2 big games against the Cowboys and the Saints. Those teams are tied for 6th and 4th in allowing the highest yards per attempt this season. Williams' big game was last week against the Buccaneers, also tied for 6th for the most yards per carry allowed. So I'm not sure either one has really differentiated himself, and I'm worried that this could end up being a timeshare.
Yeah, and it's funny, I mentioned the whole Lacy James Starks dynamic that wasn't that long ago in Green Bay. We could be heading towards something like that again with
Yes.
Jones and Williams, quite honestly. If you've got, like Aaron Jones is, like you said, sort of the first and second down guy, but on passing downs, you've got Jamal Williams. Well, we're right back where we started, and we don't have a bell cow situation there. But honestly, I think with how that offense is designed, and obviously as long as Aaron Rodgers is there and as long as Mike McCarthy's there, I don't know that you're ever going to have a running back that dominates the carries there. I think, that's a position that's not nearly as of what's the word? It's not nearly as much of a priority, you would say, as maybe like in Jacksonville or something like that. They're going to have Aaron Rodgers and they're going to air it out a lot anyway. So
I agree with that, but I will say that if I'm going to take a gamble on any of them, I think I'm doing Jones, because I think his best case scenario is a lot better than Jamal Williams' best case scenario. So I'll lean that way just for dynasty purposes. All right, let's pivot over to talk about our number 2 topic, which is Dak Prescott. I brought this up because they had the huge win over the Redskins last Thursday night, but in that blowout, air quotes, win, Prescott just went 11 for 22 for 102 yards. I feel like he's been a brewing topic for us for a couple of weeks because his season just hasn't been the same as it was last year. And Michael, I wanted to ask you whether or not you thought there was maybe a reason for Prescott performing worse, and like how you sort of view him as a dynasty quarterback now that he isn't living up to his amazing freshman season.
Well, I mean, let's look at where he stands right now, at least dynasty-wise. So our dynasty rankers have him anywhere between the 7th and 10th best quarterback for dynasty ranking purposes. So the question is, do you move him from that position? And I think right now, I personally wouldn't. I would still keep him in sort of that 7 to 10 range. It's still his second season. He's obviously still pretty young. Like you mentioned, it's not like he's had the same year that he had in his rookie year, but look, I think it's fair to say that this season, more than last season, there have been a lot of distractions, to say the least, whether it's the Elliott suspension and not having him for what amounts going to be, it's going to amount to be nearly half the season.
Yeah.
You've also got the defense, though, that has not performed as well as it did last year, at least as far as keeping the Cowboys into games. I mean, they had that 3-game stretch where, they got blown out for 3 weeks in a row, which is fairly demoralizing for anyone. So, I don't know that there's a specific reason. I mean, you could point to maybe the receivers, and maybe Dez Bryant isn't nearly as dynamic and has the playmaking ability that he used to have, and maybe they need to upgrade that in the offseason. But, if we're asking, do we move Dak Prescott away from his current standing dynasty-wise, I'm keeping him right where he is. What about you?
I'm glad you brought up Dez because he was kind of the thing that I focused on in a little bit too. Last year when Prescott was throwing to Dez, 50 for 89 for 796, 8 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. This year, 58 for 103, 639, 5 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. So he's already thrown a lot more balls to Dez this year and has a lot less yards and has more interceptions. Maybe skill is the problem. When I kind of brought this topic up in the first place, I thought it was going to be all about the offensive line. I know in the last couple of weeks we've seen the issues that they've had, in particular in run blocking. But then when I pulled up all of Prescott's pressure numbers, it's not at all what I expected to see. Last year, he had a higher completion percentage against pressure, 52.8% versus 46.7%. But his yards per attempt on pressure passes has gone way up from 5.6 to 7.0 yards per attempt. It's really on his plays without pressure that he's dropped off dramatically from 9.1 yards per attempt to 6.4. So I don't think offensive line is the reason, and I think wide receiver is the only place that it really makes sense. I mean, obviously, Dez is older than he used to be. He's taken a lot of hits in his career. Maybe he's declining. Maybe they can improve that in the offseason. But maybe, too, this is just a little bit of regression, and Prescott played over his head last season. And I think we all kind of expected the interceptions to rise a little bit after that crazy season, but yeah, I mean, I guess we could just kind of put this in the frame of, would you prefer Prescott versus some other quarterbacks? So, Michael, let me ask, would you rather have Prescott or Deshaun Watson in dynasty formats?
I would probably prefer Watson at this point. I mean, I think they're both good young dynasty assets, but I think Watson, at least, in his admittedly limited time so far, showed a bigger ability to score and make plays on his own, whereas Dak, I don't want to slap him with the sort of game manager label just yet, but I think it's obvious that Watson definitely was able to take control a lot more effectively, at least when it came to fantasy purposes, than Dak did last year. So I would go Watson between those two.
What about Prescott versus Marcus Mariota?
And Mariota, at least compared to last season, has been a bit of a disappointment. That's tough. That's a good one. I don't know. I might actually lean towards Mariota only because it seems like they have gotten to upgrading the receiving game a little faster than they have in Dallas. They both have obviously very good running backs and are geared more towards the running game, but because of, I guess, the capital they've put into the receivers in Tennessee so far, and for the short-term future, I'd probably lean Mariota, but that's a pretty close one to me.
I'll take Prescott there, and it's just because he's playing in a dome. It's not a reflection on whether or not I think he's a better player than Mariota. Okay, last one, Prescott or Jared Goff?
I might actually go Jared Goff, which is not something I ever imagined I'd be saying, at least at this point. But I like the, I guess, coaching staff, at least in its current form, more with Goff. And I think they might gear more towards the pass, or at least a more balanced offense in LA as opposed to Dallas, who I think as long as Zeke is there and they have that line, they're going to gear more towards the running game there. So if those two, I'd probably lean Goff at this point.
Okay, Michael, let's move on to topic number 3, which is Josh Gordon. I can't believe I waited till the third topic to bring him up because in a lot of ways, this is the biggest story, both in redraft and in dynasty formats. Gordon had his first game last week in, I think, maybe 2 years. He's been suspended because of substance abuse issues, but he's back, and he had a very productive first game back for the Browns with 4 catches for 85 yards on 11 targets. Now that he's actually back, Michael, where do you slot him into your dynasty rankings? Is he kind of back to where he was before? Are you optimistic? What are your thoughts?
Well, and I'm more conservative, so personally, I wouldn't put him back where he was pre-suspension. So to me, he's not at that top 10 or top 5 level that he, deservedly was before all the trouble he got into. But I mean, after yesterday, I don't know that you can put him any lower than maybe top 20, 25. So sort of in the wide receiver 2 conversation at the very least. But obviously, it's a very easy path back to where he was, especially if he keeps having games like he did yesterday. And it should only get better. I mean, that was his first game action since 2014. So once he actually starts playing more and develops some rapport with Kaiser, at least down the stretch, I would think he would rise a little higher, or should be able to. What about you?
It was great to see him back. He looked like he hadn't missed a step in terms of his physical play. He was always such a dominant athletic receiver. But I think I'm going to hit the panic button and just say, not the panic button, but urge a little bit of caution with all of this.
The caution button.
And I think the caution button, we'll invent that. And let me just remind everybody what exactly the timeline has been of Gordon's off the field issues, because there are a lot and they're kind of staggering. This starts back in 2010 when he was at Baylor in college. He was found asleep in his car with a teammate and got cited with a misdemeanor drug possession charge. The next year, he was suspended indefinitely from Baylor because of a failed drug test. 2 years later, he was suspended for his first 2 games of his second season with the Browns because of a failed drug test. 2014, he had DUI arrest. 2014, he also got suspended for 10 games for substance abuse again. Later in 2014, he was suspended by the Browns for violating team rules. 2015, he got a full year suspension because of another failed test. 2016, he got denied reinstatement because of another failed drug test. And then finally, he entered rehabilitation. And obviously, we're talking about a very serious issue here. And I think we all hope that Gordon can get over it because he's a special talent. But that's a stark history of off the field issues that makes me really question whether he can ever string multiple successful seasons together without having things derail him in the future. And Michael, let me just point out a couple of other sort of tidbits on this. Players that have never failed a drug test before, they're tested just one time per year. And once you've had your tests, you're not going to get another. So it's really, really easy to avoid getting penalized. They even have a fixed start date, so you know when to stop using marijuana if that's what you choose to do. It's just you've got to be brain dead. And basically because of the way the testing works, marijuana penalties are less severe than some of the other substance penalties. So my guess, based on what I understand about this, is that Gordon probably failed 5 tests before he even received this 10-game suspension, not even his most recent suspension. This has been an ongoing problem, a very serious problem, one where he's been getting warnings and getting suspensions and hasn't been able to right the ship, at least until maybe now. So I would absolutely use the guy in DFS. He's a great talent, but do I want him as a dynasty receiver? Frankly, not, even with the talent.
Well, my first question to you, Scott, is how much more familiar are you now with the NFL substance abuse policies? Because that sounded like pretty in-depth.
Way more familiar than I wanted to get. I think I probably researched him more than everybody else that we're talking about today. So,
well, look, you could be PFF's like resident substance abuse policy expert now, because that would probably come in handy. That's
a depressing title. That makes it sound like I know way too much about this stuff.
Well, look, we pride ourselves on knowing a lot of stuff, and that's another aspect to it.
I'll just announce to all of our listeners that I have never once failed a PFF marijuana test. Just throw that out there. Totally clean record.
And I'm not going to comment, but I would say, to your point, because I'm with you. I mean, like I said, I'm a fairly conservative dynasty player, and by no means am I slotting him back in the wide receiver 1 territory, like as my wide receiver 1. But I think to have him as your wide receiver 2 on a dynasty team, to me, I think the reward outweighs the risk. And you got to remember, he had to stay clean for a pretty long time just to get back to this point. It wasn't like he got busted recently and just got dropped back in. He had to stay clean for a long time. So I'm hopeful that he can continue doing that. Obviously, we all hope he does. And to me, I think the reward is just greater than the risk at this point, at least as my wide receiver 2. As my wide receiver 1, who's sort of the centerpiece of my team, absolutely not. But he could get there back there in a hurry.
Okay, I want to talk about another Josh, but I'm afraid I'm making him a little bit guilty by association. But Josh Doctson of the Washington Redskins, as far as I know, hasn't had any legal troubles. He has been kind of quietly maybe breaking out, Michael. Over the last month, he's averaging 6 targets per game. And I'm wondering if this is a guy that you think could be breaking out and could be an impact wide receiver for players, both through their fantasy playoffs, but more importantly in dynasty formats for such a young player still.
Yeah, I definitely think so. He actually currently is the 9th ranked receiver as far as our PFF wide receiver rating, which is essentially what the quarterback's rating is when they throw to said receiver. He's 9th out of 88 possible receivers in that set, which I thought was pretty good. He would obviously rank amongst the best if he qualified for more. He just hasn't been on the field as much as some other receivers this year. But, I think he obviously came in with a lot of hype from TCU. His rookie season, I'm not going to call it a disaster. It got delayed severely thanks to an injury. Sure. He only saw, I think, 2 targets the entire season. But, he's got a good quarterback in Cousins. I would venture to say it's more likely than not Cousins stays there. If he does, I think Doctson is definitely on the wide receiver 2 radar for next season. I think Jamison Crowder probably is the wide receiver to own there long term, but I think really? Doctson and Crowder could be just as effective as, say, Deshaun Jackson and Pierre Garçon were in Washington under that head coach and Jay Gruden and under Cousins. With Doctson, what I found surprising was, and I know you are probably going to mention this, but he obviously was known for sort of his deep balls at TCU and his jump balls, but he actually hasn't ranked that highly when it comes to deep ball catching percentage this season. He's only 27th. I think he's caught a third of his deep targets of 15 this year. So to me, that shows me that he's not just sort of a one-trick pony, or at least he's not, I guess, utilizing what he was supposed to or what we all thought he was going to coming in. He's actually becoming a more well-rounded receiver. What do you think?
I do agree with that. And you're right. I was going to mention this, that Doctson, the fact that he's 6'2", he's a good leaper and a good deep route runner. That means that I think he's going to translate and score those touchdowns at this level too. He actually had 25 touchdowns his last 2 seasons in TCU, so that's a huge number. So I think that's the reason, that's why I was so shocked that you brought up Crowder as a comparison, because I feel like even though Crowder's like maybe mid-case scenario could be just as good as Doctson's or even better, Doctson's upside is just so much higher in my mind, because I could see him having seasons where he has more than 1,000 yards and like 15 touchdowns. Now, obviously that's a pie in the sky, best case kind of scenario. But there are some things that are sort of skewing towards that being a potential reality. The number one, I would guess, being the fact that Terrell Pryor has been such a bust. He actually signed a 1-year contract with the Redskins, so he's an undrafted free agent that won't be returning to the team next year in all likelihood. I feel like Doctson is going to be their number one outside receiver. And even if the quarterback situation potentially changes, I think that has a lot of potential for fantasy. So yeah, I'm optimistic. I'd much rather have him than the other Josh in Dynasty. I know that maybe that's just me
Really?
at this point. Yes, definitely.
Wow, that is a scorching hot take, Scott.
Am I really on my
Doctson
island
over
here?
Gordon. Wow.
Not as talented.
I think so.
Okay. Well,
I mean, look, and I get it. I think definitely Doctson is the safer play by far, meaning he doesn't, obviously have the history. There's nothing, to indicate that he will be an issue or have the same issues as Gordon. But wow, okay. Well, look, that would be a very interesting sort of prop bet 1 year from now after they've played a whole season.
Yeah, send me your hate tweets at Scott_Spratt. I'd love to hear how wrong I am, but that's kind of where I'm leaning right now. Okay, Michael, let's move on to our fifth topic. Also talking receivers, but this time talking Jags receivers. This has kind of become a really interesting scenario. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the fact that Cousins could have a potential landing spot in Jacksonville. Not to be critical of Blake Bortles every time I open my mouth, but it seems like the Jaguars are destined to have a better quarterback situation next year than they have this year. And because of that, I think we need to talk about their receivers because they kind of have a lot of guys potentially in the mix next season, and I'm not sure who the favorite is to be the guy to own in fantasy. So, Michael, let me ask you, who do you like best out of the group of, I'm sort of claiming the group is Allen Robinson, Marquise Lee, Keelan Cole, and D.D. Westbrook. Which of those guys do you like best, and am I missing somebody that deserves to be in this conversation?
Well, you've got Alan Hearns, who has strung together a couple decent. Well, he had one good season, I should say. Last season was kind of a bust, and he's been another bust this year before an ankle injury. But, out of those, I don't see anyone sort of supplanting Allen Robinson at this point. I mean, yes, Robinson's got the torn ACL, so he's going to be coming back from that next year, even if he re-signs at Jacksonville, which it's up for debate at this point. He'll be a free agent. He could be franchised. He could take one of those lower market value 1-year prove-it deals. But if he were to come back, I would still, I think, choose him just because he's got the physical tools, obviously, and he's done it before. And really, those other guys, there's a lot of holes, I think, in their game. Not one of those sort of strikes me as a guy that could surpass him on the depth chart. What do you think?
I agree with that. And out of just the sort of the basic stats that I pulled up, Allen Robinson does lead that set with 8 yards per attempt or per target over the last couple of years. And obviously Robinson's the only one that's really lasted multiple years, but he's the guy in that respect. But what if I then threw in the fact that Robinson is actually an unrestricted free agent after this season and isn't even guaranteed to be back with the Jaguars at all? If I pulled him out and said maybe he signed somewhere else, what do you think of those other 3 guys? Is there one of them that maybe stands out?
Well, I would say before the season, I know a lot of people were high on D.D. Westbrook. Obviously, he fell in the draft a little bit due to some issues at Oklahoma. And look, he didn't even play most of the season. He's really only been able to play the last 3 weeks. He does have 15 catches, not, a huge yards per catch or 8 out. It's only a 10 per 3 as far as his yards per catch goes. I don't know. He's been a little too inconsistent for me. If anyone, I might lean towards Keelan Cole, who really came on towards the end of preseason to have some sort of rookie hype. But to me, I don't know. He's been, again, of the most of those guys that you mentioned left over, the most consistent, which really isn't saying much. But if I had to pick one, I'd probably lean on him. What about you?
Well, I'm glad I'm not on an island then, because I have really liked Cole, and I know that he doesn't have nearly the sort of the pedigree of Westbrook, but I haven't really been super thrilled with what I've seen from Westbrook the last few weeks. You mentioned that he had a relatively low average depth of target. It's the lowest on the team, but he's also got a low 6.2 yards per target so far this season. Those two don't really mesh up to me. Like, if you're going to be a shorter target, then you should catch more of your balls and be able to break those yards after the catch. I mean, that's kind of what he was known for. He was really more of a deep threat in college. He had a lot of catches that went 25 plus yards down the field. Maybe it's the quarterback that's the problem there, but Westbrook hasn't blown me away so far. I'm not going to going to bury the guy after a few starts in his rookie season. But I think Cole is a legitimate sleeper. And so maybe this is all a big way of saying that this might be a stay away situation for now, but at least relative to like where they're going in dynasty leagues in rankings, I'm bullish on Cole relative to his ranking and bearish on Westbrook relative to his ranking.
Yeah, and I think we can agree. I don't see Marquise Lee going back there next year, right? He's a free agent. Hasn't exactly, he's been okay this season, but I don't know that he's a guy that they would prioritize bringing back over, obviously guys like Robinson or working with guys like Westbrook or Cole.
Honestly, I'm not sure what they're going to do, and I feel so much of this sort of circles around who they're going to get to be their quarterback next season. So I think I'm just too nervous to really predict who it's going to be. But Cole, look at Cole in some of your dynasty leagues. I bet he's available in a number of them. All right, Michael, our last topic of the week, we had a couple of relatively unknown running backs that had some productive days in fantasy this week. We had Tion Green, running back for the Detroit Lions, and then Mike Davis, running back for the Seattle Seahawks. I'll mention briefly that Green, he is a rookie undrafted out of Cincinnati. Davis is a former fourth-round pick by your 49ers back a couple of years ago, and I think this is his third team now with the Seahawks. So, Michael, the fact that these guys are relatively unknown probably says a lot, but do either of them interest you at all in fantasy?
I'll say this. If I had to pick one, I would personally probably lean Green. It seems like Detroit is constantly figuring out that first and second down back question. They've had Amir Abdullah that they've given a go the last 3 seasons, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like he's caught on or is sort of, proven to be the long-term answer there. And, they've had a couple of other guys behind him that they've tried out. Zach Zenner. I know you were going to mention Dwayne Washington, which, he wasn't even activated yesterday. Instead, they went with Green. So to me, I think they might want to see what they have in Green, at least while Abdullah, maybe he's coming back from injury like he was this past week. With Davis, it seems like ever since Marshawn Lynch retired out of Seattle, it's just been a revolving door of options there that they can't quite seem to settle on, where there is, Thomas Rawls had a breakout season, but never could sort of follow up with that. We were all high on Kristen Michael the first and the second time that he was in Seattle, but that didn't work out. Then you had Eddie Lacy that they brought in. They don't seem to be real high on him. Chris Carson for a couple of weeks there seemed to win the job, both short-term and long-term, but then he got hurt, which is really the only reason Davis has been thrown out there. So, if I had to pick one, I'd probably lean Green, but I'm not really bullish on either one of them.
For Green, I really wish I knew why Dwayne Washington was made inactive this week. So he had missed the previous 2 weeks because of an injury, but was practicing all week this week and seemed healthy. So this was like a healthy scratch situation. I wonder if he might have violated a team rule and this was a punishment or something. I thought that was really strange. But it's worth mentioning that the reason that Green played too is that Amir Abdullah missed the week with a neck injury. So it's not like he's climbed to the top of the depth chart, which Davis, at least because of injuries and everything else, has in Seattle. And Davis has 2.7 yards after contact per attempt. That's pretty much the same as Chris Carson, so that's really a good stylistic fit for the Seahawks and their bad offensive line. But his overall yards per attempt, it's 3.0, is not very good, and it's much worse than Carson at 4.2. I think he's a relatively strong fit with the Seahawks, but isn't necessarily a strong player. But he's got a job, so I'm not ready to quite ignore him in fantasy, but I don't really think he's much to be owning in dynasty formats, I guess is my thought, Michael. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think when Carson comes back, he's going to be the man there. And personally, just on a quick side note, I really like Carson. I think he's going to be a decent asset going into next season. And I think they really like him too, which is even more important. I think they've swung and missed on Rawls and in Lacy, and I think they like what they have in Carson. He just needs to get healthy and stay on the field there.
I agree. He's a former stash of the week. But we're not quite ready for stash of the week. We first need to do a little gunpoint banner, Michael. So let's crank that out.
Guys.
Gunpoint banter.
I thought we'd have a little fun with Gunpoint Banner this week and kind of make fun of some of the things that we've said in recent weeks. So this week's topic is which player who we've discussed in the last few episodes have you grown more optimistic about because of his recent performances? And I'm nominating 3 players for this: Kenny Stills, Ricky Seals-Jones, and Kenyon Drake. Okay, here's what I had to say a couple of weeks ago about why I had some trepidations about Kenny Stills. My second reservation is kind of the quarterback situation in Miami. I do think that Matt Moore is the best fit for Stills' skill set, especially with the deep balls. Moore tries more passes deep and has more yards per attempt on medium and deep throws than either Tannehill or Cutler. Tannehill's deep accuracy has long been a problem for him, but it seems like he's had the most success with Moore behind center. In fact, 3 of his 4 games where he's seen at least 8 targets have come with Moore playing. Now, in that same episode, here were Michael's reservations about Ricky Seals-Jones.
Arizona, specifically under Bruce Arians, just doesn't use the tight end at all. I went back and looked. The top 2 tight ends for the Cardinals got 80 targets last year.
Yeah.
They got 60 targets in 2015 and 70 targets in 2014. So if you just, cut it down the middle, that's about 70 targets for their top 2 options.
And finally, here were the concerns I had about Kenyon Drake. By some of the PFF grading numbers, he actually hasn't really been that good of a runner. And I think part of the reason he hasn't been used more throughout his career, both at Alabama and in Miami, is because of injury history. And he's 210 pounds. He's kind of small. He's a guy that can do work as a special teamer. I don't know. He doesn't really strike me as a guy that has the potential to be a 3-down guy, because I just don't think he's going to hold up to the work. Okay, Michael, which of these 3 players do you think has improved his stock the most in your eyes?
Well, I am actually more optimistic on Kenny Stills after this week. I know we talked about the fact that he seemed to have a pretty good rapport with Matt Moore, and obviously had that again a couple weeks ago when he broke out for, I think it was 180 yards or so. But Jay Cutler came back this week, and not to make light of Jay Cutler's revenge game against Denver, but Stills actually did well with Cutler, and Cutler did well too. Stills had 5 for 98 and a touchdown. So I think for me with Stills, it's been a tough situation in Miami this year between the injury to Tannehill, bringing Cutler in, and he gets knocked out, and then you get Matt Moore. But I think if anything, Stills has proven that he can produce no matter who's throwing the ball there.
I like that pick, Michael, with Stills. He's already got 733 receiving yards this season in 12 games. That passed his total from all 16 last year. But for me, the guy is actually Ricky Seals-Jones. I know he was the one of these that we were down the most on, understandably, having kind of been an out-of-the-nowhere guy. But we were concerned about the fact that Bruce Arians doesn't really use tight ends. But while Seals-Jones is lined up as a tight end on 28 of his 40 snaps, he's actually either run a pass route or run blocked on all of those snaps. He has 0 pass block attempts this season. What I think that means is that he's actually a wide receiver who just happens to have tight end eligibility. And I actually don't think he's going to lose that tight end eligibility because of the way he's being lined up on the field. So for a fantasy owner, that's outstanding. With this 3 games so far this season with the Cardinals, averaging 5 targets a game, 3 catches a game, 57 yards a game, and 1 touchdown per game, I think he's back to being kind of in the back end of the tight end 2 range in Dynasty formats. I know that's kind of a lot coming from a guy that we literally didn't know 3 weeks ago, but that's how impressed I've been so far this season. Michael, what do you think about that?
Yeah, to me, the big number that stands out is the targets. Like you mentioned, he's got at least 5 in the last 3 weeks, which, as far as tight ends go, that's decent. And like you said, I think it's squarely in the tight end 2 conversation. And if he can keep those kinds of numbers up, meaning the 5 targets a game, and pull down, 3 or 4 of them, I think the chances are pretty good that he, has a touchdown fairly often, at least as far as tight ends go. And look, I go back to he's got an obvious rapport with Gabbert, and I'm not saying Gabbert will be or should be the quarterback next year, but in the off chance that he is, and maybe they don't find a long-term solution there, I think that only bodes well for him. So I think, I think probably now's a good time to get Seals-Jones in your dynasty team if you can. I mean, trade deadlines have passed, but I would definitely hold on to him this offseason and hope that they sort of develop him a little more this offseason.
Let's finish this off with our stashes of the week.
I'm telling you, these shares are hot. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. It's definitely a good idea. Dwayne, I get it. Now, can you get me? Have I ever lied to you? That's right. And ask around. I never do, Dwayne.
Stash of the week.
Okay, Michael, why don't you get us started with who your pick is?
So I'm going to go with receiver Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He was a pretty decent rookie pick as far as rookie drafts go. I mean, obviously not drafted as highly as the first-round picks like Corey Davis and Mike Williams, but talent-wise, I know a lot of people liked him. They obviously like his youth, too. He's only 21 this season. And he landed on a good situation, at least what we thought was a good situation heading into the season, sort of, being an apprentice, if you will, or an heir to Mike Evans and Deshaun Jackson, where not a whole lot was really expected of him. So he could sort of ride the bench and learn from those two guys, if you will. Now, he was pushed into more action in Week 10 when Mike Evans was suspended and actually filled the Mike Evans role pretty well. He led the team in targets that game with 10, pulled down 5 of them for 68 yards. Now, he's been relegated back to the bench, meaning they're not sort of creating plays or a role for him. He's sort of definitely the outside receiving option there. But, for as cheap as he probably is at this point, and the fact that there's going to be more rookie receivers flooding Dynasty rosters this offseason, I'm going to stash him. I think he's a pretty good prospect the rest of the way. And look, you can't deny the youth and the team he's on, and for that, he's my stash.
Michael, it blew my mind when I looked this up, but Michael Evans isn't even leading their team in yards per attempt. That's actually Chris Godwin at 7.9 yards per attempt. Not even necessarily a high number, but suddenly it seems like they really could use some good receivers, and I could see Godwin potentially being one of them. Okay, for my stash of the week, I'm going to go with Johnny Holton, wide receiver of the Oakland Raiders. Holton is 6'1", 190 pounds, undrafted out of Cincinnati back in 2016, who was kind of a one-trick speed pony, just a downfield threat. He barely played his last season in college, but he averaged 27.1 yards per catch. Obviously huge. This season, he hadn't really kind of gotten into the mix before Week 13. He had just 6 targets. But last week, Michael Crabtree was suspended, obviously. And so Holton ended up with 7 targets kind of out of nowhere. And now that he's played a little bit this season, he's up to 200 total receiving yards on just 97 pass routes run. That 2.06 yards per route run is behind just Robbie Anderson, Michael Thomas, and Tyreek Hill as the best among sophomore wide receivers. He's got that huge 23.5 average depth of the target because of his speed. And that really fills a need for the Raiders because they don't have anyone higher than Crabtree at 11.7 yards. That's a really low number to be the number 1 deep threat on the team. So I'm thinking that Holton, maybe down the line, could have some Ted Ginn potential. Do you see that at all, Michael?
I don't know about Ted Ginn, just because Ted Ginn's skill set is so narrow and unique, though. But I think it definitely helps to have some options at receiver in Oakland, because like we saw this week, the position, I'm not going to call it extremely fragile, but it is still, I think more fragile than we like to believe. So you got Crabtree, who's obviously not a young spring chicken anymore, who given was not playing this game because he was injured. It's because he got in a fight and was suspended. But between that and Cooper, who was knocked out with an injury with that pretty brutal concussion, I think it helps to have options there. I don't know that, Seth Roberts is going to fill that role if these guys are out long-term, meaning Cooper and Crabtree. I don't know that Cordarrelle Patterson is going to be involved in the passing game a whole lot. I think he's fairly relegated to the return game. But I think to have somebody like Holton, who, look, in his very brief appearance, show that he's at least competent, I think is a good thing to have, especially tied to a good young quarterback like Derek Carr, who they're obviously not going to move on from anytime soon.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Dynasty Slant from PFF Fantasy. Thanks to everybody that's been listening, and I encourage you all to subscribe to our podcast. It's part of the PFF Fantasy Specialty podcasts that also include the IDP shows that tend to come out on Wednesdays and DFS shows that come out on Thursdays.